All right, good morning, everybody. Hope we're all doing really well. Today, we're going to be talking about John Rawls's social contract theory and distributive justice. So, recall we've been looking at our kind of map of ethical theories, and we're looking at this today, Rawls and distributive justice, and we're going to be looking at moral theories that focus primarily on institutional structures, right? So, the question are, what do our institutions owe us, right? What do we owe our institutions? How is it that society should be structured such that we respect everybody's interests equally, and such that we benefit people who are worse off than others, right? So these are the sorts of questions that Rawls is going to be trying to tackle with his distributive justice theory. Okay, so distributive justice. So Rawls's theory is a sort of builds off of the social contract. The social contract is this largely Enlightenment story that says, well, what justifies our social structures? What justifies our institutions? And the idea is that if we imagine the state of nature, right? This is a state in which there is no government in place, right? It's every person for his or herself. If we imagine a state of affairs like that, right, we would think we might wonder and speculate about what our lives would look like there, right? Whether or not like we would kill each other and all these different things, or whether or not we could like kind of get along. But the idea is that, look, more than likely we're going to be killing one another in that kind of circumstance, right? If there are no consequences to our actions, like if you have something that I want, I could just like take it from you and kill you for it. So what we do, or what people do in the state of nature, is they come up with a contract, right? They say, okay, look, I'm not going to kill you and you're not going to kill me, and then we're going to share this resource, right? We're going to share this apple tree. And they're like, oh, okay, great. Yeah. So you see this guy's like, I won't kill you if you won't kill me. And he says, oh, okay, that sounds really good. So um, Rawls's theory is based on the social contract because it asks, what is it that people will agree to, right? What kind of contract or what kind of dictates will people want to consent to? Okay. And there's a quote from Rawls there. Okay. So, first of all, Rawls wants to reject utilitarianism. So recall, utilitarianism is the moral theory that says that we need to, um, what is right and what is wrong is based on outcomes, right? And the best outcomes are the ones that optimize the good, where the good is understood as pleasure or hedonic welfare. And so sometimes that might mean that we have to kill somebody in order to optimize the good, right? So we talked about the whether or not we should give the person over to the angry mob example a few classes ago, and so Rawls is critiquing that theory, right? So he thinks that even though that might be a plausible moral theory, we don't need to structure our institutions, right, our government bodies, as a utilitarian structure, right? Because sometimes utilitarianism is going to demand that that we sometimes utilitarianism is going to demand that we kill somebody in order to optimize the good. If it's better for all of us that somebody's dead, like we got to kill that person. But that person isn't going to consent to that kind of social structure, right? Who would knowingly consent to a contract in which they get no benefit and die? Nobody's going to do that, right? So Rawls wants to say that we need to have social structures that are structured such that we could in principle, or would in principle, consent to those structures, right? And given that that the utilitarian social structures are such that we would not want to agree to those, we need different kinds of social structures, right? So How is it? Oh, and here's some empirical data. Okay, so there's like gigantic welfare gaps, right? Just like as an empirical fact about the world. So I'll look at like this graph here, this one in the top left corner. Uh, this is the distribution of wealth, and you see that the vast majority of the wealth is concentrated in the top 20% of wealthy people, right? And then it goes down from there, right? So it looks like 80% of the country only owns about 15% of the wealth, right? Um, and so, like, when we think about the distribution of various resources, we need to think about what kinds of like distribution would we consent to, right? And so Rawls is going to entertain that question with us. But this is just to show that, like, empirically, there are these welfare, or not welfare, but these wage gaps, right? These income or wealth gaps. And then same thing here, you can look at these a little bit more on your own, right? So this is if the US landmass were divided like US wealth, 1% would own like all of California and the West, 9% would own like this, 30% would own the bottom part, right? And then like most of the people would be in this little tiny town, right? So, um, so the idea here is that just in fact, right, there are these huge wage gaps, or not wage gaps, but wealth gaps between people who have money and people who don't have money, people who are the richest and people who are the poorest. Okay, so um, how is it that we're going um, to figure out what it is that people desire? So how is it that we figure out what social structures that people would consent to? Rawls gives us a kind of formula, right? So he wants to talk about this is a thought experiment, right? So this doesn't actually happen. Nobody actually does this, right? But the idea is that if we were to do this, right, if this were to happen, this is what we would choose. And given that we would do that in that kind of scenario, that makes a claim about how things work in the actual world. Okay. So the idea is something like this. Well, what is justice? We're trying to figure out, well, what's justice? Okay. And we need some principles of justice that are going to guide our society. Okay. So for example, let's suppose that we don't have a constitution and we're trying to write a constitution, right? And it's this is everybody that exists or exists in a certain society, and we need to figure out what we're going to put in our constitution. Uh, Rawls wants to say that what we do, how we go about writing our constitution or coming up with the principles of justice, is to enter the original position. So in the original position, we are coming up with the principles of justice, coming up with our constitution, but we also put on the veil of ignorance, right? And the veil of ignorance is this idea that everybody that puts on the veil of ignorance forgets their gender, forgets their socioeconomic status, forgets their race, forgets their natural abilities, right? Their psychological features, all of these different things, right? All of that knowledge is stripped from us, right? And then we have to look at general information about the society, right? What the society is going to look like. And then we come up with the various principles based on our position of ignorance, right? About ourselves and about the people who are kind of closest to us, right? Okay. So the idea here is that when we enter into that state of ignorance, we don't know whether or not we're going to be like part of the richest group or part of the poorest group, right? So the idea is that we need to make society such that the people who are the worst off are made as good as they can be, right? because we don't know whether or not we're going to be part of that group. So given that people are like generally kind of selfish all the time, right? Like I'm interested in what Spencer's interested in, and if somebody else has an interest that's against mine, like I'm going to try and defend my interest against their interest, right? So so people are just like kind of generally kind of selfish, right? And so if we were to come up with all of these policies without us being in the state of ignorance, without the veil of ignorance, then we would pick principles of justice or pick a constitution or write a constitution that would benefit ourselves. But given that we don't know anything about ourselves, we have to think about, well, what if I were one of the poorest people? I wouldn't want to be like that bad off. So we need to make society such that there are lots of structures to help the poor, right? Rather than having a society where there is not that kind of structure. So um, Rawls wants to say that there are two principles of justice that we would come up with in the original position. The first is the liberty principle. So this is like all of the different principles like in the Declaration of Independence, as well as like the in the Constitution. But the idea is like right to or freedom of speech, freedom to hold property, freedom of bodily autonomy and personhood, right? Like nobody can just like touch my body without my consent, right? All of these things, freedom of assembly and such, freedom of religion. So given that, let's say that one of the facts about our society, right? Suppose we're in the original position and 99% of the people in our society adopt one religion and 1% of the people in our society adopt some other religion, right? Uh, Given that we don't know whether we belong to the 99% religion or the 1% religion, we're gonna say, well, if I am a part of that 1% religion, we need to have a policy, right? It needs to be in our constitution that um, I can't be excluded from society. I can't be unjustly killed by ascribing to a minority religion, right? So, given that we want to make things as good off as possible, if we're part of, for ourselves, if we're part of the smaller group, we would pick this liberty principle, right? And you can run experiment. You can, kind of think about each one of these different freedoms within the given context, right? So, the second principle that we would choose from the original position is the difference principle. We've kind of already touched on this, but the idea is something like, look, if we're going to pick different political scenarios or different economic scenarios, right? So suppose that from the original position, we have a social structure that puts like poor people way down here and rich people way up here, right? And we have another social structure that puts poor people like right here and puts like rich people like right here, right? We are going to pick the second social structure, right? We're going to pick the second policy because we don't know if we're part of the poorest group. And if we are part of the poorest group, we don't we want to give ourselves the very best um, um, like the most amount of resources that we can, most number of resources that we can, right? So it's in our self-interest to structure society such that the poor are benefited, right? And we're not going to want to gamble with that. So Rawls says that we don't want to gamble, right? We don't want to just take the risk and just assume that we are part of the richest people, right? That would be against our interests. Um, so so the idea is that when we strip away all of our different features, we are going to structure society such that the poor are made the best off rather than a society that makes poor people very like the worst off, right? Um, and that's because we don't know whether or not we're poor and we want to benefit ourselves. And so we assume that um, we're some of the poor ones, the poor people, and then we make society such that those people are like made the better off. And that's like having a society with like welfare programs, right, with unemployment benefits that can support like lower income people, you know. So we want a society with all of these social programs rather than a society that doesn't have those social programs. Okay. Okay, so we've been talking about the difference principle, um, but the idea here is that um, we want the people that are the lowest in society to be as better off. So, given two different states of affairs, we're going to want to distribute resources a little bit more, right? And another thing is that any inequalities for Rawls are justified only if the people that are a little bit lower are benefited in some way by the inequality. So, for example, a society where there's poor people and rich people, and the rich people don't really have anything to do with the poor people is unjust. But a society that's structured more like, look, there are rich people and there are poor people, but the rich people in some way benefit the poor people, right? That's inequity or inequality that's in some way justified. Okay. And okay, so we might ask like, okay, Rawls, like you're talking about all this hypothetical stuff, right? Can this society actually exist? And I think so, right? So according to Rawls, we need to have um, a constitution that has basic liberties that are protected by a government. Um, we need democratic political processes. The economy has to be free but regulated. So I mean, it seems like the society that Rawls is talking about uh, can at least be reached toward, right, in our own society with different policies, with like welfare programs and unemployment programs to help people when they're like down and out, right? To have various social nets to help people back up when they fall down, right? So what we can do is we can sort of uh, structure our society kind of like Rawls wants to see it, even though it's not perfect. Yeah, so here is this really helpful summary of the reading, right? So the idea is that we're looking at what's the central question, right? What's the target of this reading, right? That's like the first part of the article. And then he wants to go over kind of how a social contract works, and then we're going over how do we figure out what people would agree to, and that's all that stuff about the original position and the veil of ignorance. And then there's business about what is it that people should agree to according to Rawls, and that's the liberty principle and the difference principle, right? So if you haven't read this yet, uh, look at this kind of outline, and it should help structure a lot of the reading for you. And the second half of the reading is kind of going over some of the practice, looking at examples and stuff, which is like a little less important. So first half of the reading is the more important stuff, and that's kind of what we've been targeting in lecture. So anyway, if you have any questions, just email me. I'd be happy to talk to you.